When I was first looking into Orthodox Christianity, one of the things that struck me as unique and impressive about it was its cosmic view of both the fall of man and man's redemption in Jesus Christ. In the case of the fall, we believe that Adam's original sin wasn't just some sort of moral failure on his part that only impacted him and his descendants, but that it impacted all of creation because man was created as the head of creation, a microcosm of creation, the image of God, so that there's this ontological link between man and all of creation. And in a way, creation is dependent upon man and upon the state of man, so that when Adam separated himself from God, all of creation was separated from God as well. And then we see Jesus Christ as doing what Adam couldn't do and what no man could ever do after Adam, which is to reunite creation and God. God became man so that man could become God. And because man has this link with creation as the head of creation, all of creation is brought into the divine life through Christ's incarnation, death, resurrection, and ascension. One of the things that I found useful with this cosmic view of things is how it seemingly answers the problem of evil when it comes to the existence of natural evil. Because to me, it always made sense that evil would exist in the world when we're talking about evil committed by one man against others, because humans are created with free will, because it's part of God's goodness to give us free will so that there's no contradiction between the reality of God's omnipotence and his omnibenevolence and the existence of evil in the world, because this evil was caused by human beings in their freedom. But when it came to the existence of natural evil, this seemed to be much more difficult, because how can we explain the existence of evil that seemingly has no relationship to human action whatsoever, such as earthquakes or animal attacks, etc.? Well, I think Orthodox theology solves this problem because natural evil is just derivative of our own evil, of conscious sin, because man, as the microcosm of creation, as the center, the head of creation, impacts all of creation, and his state is directly impacts the state of the world. Now, when I first heard this, I found it compelling, I found it interesting, but I didn't really understand the internal logic of it, because it almost seems a little bit abstract, and you're kind of left wondering, well, why is it like that? Why did God create the world like this? How exactly does it work? And it wasn't until I read St. Maximus the Confessor that I really began to understand the true implications of this cosmic view of both the fall and of Christ. So I want this video to just be some reflections on my understanding of St. Maximus's theology and his anthropology. So to begin with, we have to start with the ontology, because remember, we understand the fall as an ontological event, as an ontological separation between man and God, and we also understand the work of Christ as performing an ontological union between man and God. Now, one of the central ideas in Maximus's theology and his ontology is the idea that existence is movement, that to exist is to be in motion. To exist is to be in motion towards another, something separate from ourselves. Put in a different way, being is communion. Maximus will often call this motion energy. He'll say that human beings have both a human nature and an energy, and the energy is this nature as it is existing. There is no existence without this movement. There is no me without me moving my arms right now, or talking, or my body performing all of these natural functions that keep me alive. Without this movement, there would be no me. I am my movement, my motion, because my existence is always emotion. It is always a doing of my being. Being is itself a verb. This is something that people tend to forget. I think that there's sort of a Platonic influence there. Now, this is a quote from Maximus's Ambigua, and I believe he's actually quoting St. Dionysius the Areopagite here. And in this passage, it really gets to the core of this understanding of being as communion, or existence as motion. The only valid proof that this essence is present in its entirety, moreover, is its natural constitutive power, which one would not be mistaken in calling a natural energy, properly and primarily characteristic of the nature in question, since it is the most generic motion constitutive of species, and contains every property that naturally belongs to the essence, apart from which there is only non-being, since only that which has absolutely no being whatsoever, according to the great teacher, has neither motion nor existence. So you see here that St. Dionysius is linking motion with being in such a way that only nothingness has no motion whatsoever. Anything that exists is in motion because, again, being is a verb. Being is synonymous with doing. Now, what Maximus will say is that all motion is motion towards something and is therefore teleological. It is always moving towards some particular end, some particular thing. Now, to act according to our proper telos, to follow our proper telos, is to move towards God. It's to be virtuous. And it's also to move towards others in communion with others. That is why Christ says that the two commandments are to love others and to love God. This is, of course, the horizontal axis. This is communion with others within creation, and the vertical axis, communion with God, which form the symbol of the cross. So because to act rightly is to move towards our proper telos, which is ultimately always God. It's always communion with God, and we commune with God, and through our being united in God, we're united with other people. To act wrongly, to sin, is simply to move towards the wrong end, to move away from the telos which fulfills your being. I would argue that it's misleading to even call sin movement at all. Yes, it is movement, but it is a movement that is self-negating. It destroys itself. It is a movement that destroys motion. In the case of idolatry and the passions, we are moving towards the finite. We are investing our being into the finite, and this finitude is exhaustible, and it will eventually all be exhausted, and there will no longer be any more movement because what we're moving towards has been taken away. When Christ reclaims all of creation for himself, those who have invested the entirety of their being into these things which are only properly fulfilled and properly exist in God, they will no longer have the ability to move towards them, because to move towards them will mean to move towards God. And what sin does is it separates you from God. So when God reclaims everything, there is no longer any room for movement. And this is how we understand hell. This is how Staniloy explains hell in his Experience of God series. He talks about how hell is this pure monotony, this pure repetition, this inability to transcend yourself, to move towards the other in a communal way, because there is like this absolute immersion within selfhood, within egoism. And this is why all sin is ultimately pride. This sin is ultimately movement towards nothing but yourself. In the case of the passions, for example, gluttony. What's wrong with gluttony is the selfishness aspect in it. So ultimately, the evil in every sin doesn't have to do with the things in the world that we're using, because these things are good. But it's the fact that we're acting in a way that is ultimately only in service of the self. And you can't move towards yourself. There's only movement towards another. Motion is movement towards something other than yourself. So sin is actually the destruction of movement. So when we say that existence is movement, to exist is to be in motion, this doesn't just apply to humans. This also applies to creation as well. Now the question is, if all of creation has a natural movement, what is the telos of creation? Where is creation supposed to move to? And the answer in Orthodox Christian theology is man. Creation is meant to be fulfilled in man. Creation is essentially bound up with the fate of man because it receives its purpose, its meaning, only in relation to man. This is actually the topic of the first chapter of Staniloy's Experience of God, where he talks about how animals and rocks and plants, they don't know themselves. They aren't conscious of themselves, and therefore, in themselves, they have no meaning. they're completely meaningless. But they do have meaning in relation to man, who knows their inner rationality which God has given it. Creation only has any meaning with man, who is able to know creation as something with meaning. The meaning which God has put within creation, the rational ordering of creation, only can become what it truly is through the revelation of this meaning which man is meant to engage in. We are meant to search creation, search the innermost depths, find what God has hidden in there, the true nature of things. We are meant to understand them, cultivate them, and through this knowledge, use them in a way which glorifies God. So we see how all of creation finds its meaning and its purpose in man, and is therefore meant to be in movement towards man. One biblical example of this is the case of animals and the Garden of Eden. Now, according to, I believe, the Syriac tradition, there were no animals in the Garden of Eden. They were actually outside of the garden, but were meant to come into the garden. But because of man's fall, they were never able to come into the garden. The fate of animals, their purpose, was intimately tied up with man, but because man fell, because he was kicked out of the garden, they were no longer able to go into the garden either, because the only way they could do so was through the action of man, who, of course, Adam has this hierarchical role in his relationship with the animals, because Adam is the one who knows them for what they are. Adam names the animals. This is one of the first things that Adam does after being created. And then we'll see only a few chapters later with Noah how to act in a virtuous way, how to act in accordance with our telos, to move towards God. We see how this actually, this vertical movement also unites us on the horizontal level, because unlike with Adam, who was kicked out of the garden and brought the animals with him, or the animals weren't able to go in because of Adam's fall, we see with Noah, who builds a new Eden, the ark, all of the animals are brought into it and are saved along with him. This is yet another example of how the fate of animals and the fate of all of creation is intimately bound up with man. So with all this established, I think we can now provide a more precise explanation for the existence of natural evil. Everything in creation has a natural motion. It is in motion, and movement is always a movement towards something. It's towards a telos. Now man was the telos, is the telos of the rest of creation. But when man fell, there was no longer that telos for the rest of creation to move to. So that natural movement, that natural movement which fulfills the purpose of the rest of creation, was no longer possible. The very destination that creation was supposed to move towards had fallen. It was no longer there. And this just caused a complete disordering of creation, so that all of creation fell alongside man. All of creation fell alongside man because man was the definite goal of all of creation. Creation only has meaning, it only has a purpose in relation to man, and therefore can only fulfill its purpose through communion with man. But because Adam and all of humanity fell from its proper place within this hierarchy, that telos, the telos of creation, was no longer there. And again, this just caused the disorder that we see in the natural world. And it was through Christ. Christ took the right proper place as the head of creation. He acted in accordance with the will of God. He united himself with God, and therefore he reestablished the harmony of this communal hierarchy, so that the world now has a proper destination, and that destination is the God-man, Jesus Christ.
Wait, Trey, you're saying Christ is the telos to whom we are bound?
You know what, Allheart? I think he is.